All right, here we are, 10 a.m., top of the hour, at least Pacific time. Marianne, I'm realizing that I've sent you my link to log in, so the programs team will give you your own and you won't be an imposter. But appreciate Marianne, Paul, and Luciana joining us today. The third session is going to discuss voluntary carbon market business and legal considerations. In other words, how do corporates who want to participate wisely in the current framework? We're going to come back to the year 2022, pretend you have a budget to spend, and how do you spend it wisely? So please join me in welcoming the myriad issues at play discussed by Paul Barker, Luciana Aquino-Hagedorn, and Marianne Megaris. Paul Barker is a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, based in San Francisco, and is a member of the firm's ESG and Impact Practice Group, which advises some of the world's most sophisticated private equity firms, corporations, and project sponsors and lenders on complex and evolving ESG and climate-related issues. Paul's practice focuses on climate change, carbon markets, and sustainable finance, and he is also a research fellow at our very own Stanford Law School Gould Center for Conflict Resolution. Luciana Aquino-Hagedorn is a global lawyer and strategic advisor with almost 20 years of combined major law firm and in-house experience. She's the general counsel of NCX, a carbon marketplace. She's also a senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, Columbia University, and a lecturer at Boston University School of Law. From 2015 to 2020, she was a partner at Goodwin Procter, where she founded and co-led the impact and responsible investing practice. Prior to that, she was Senior Vice President, Natural Resources at Harvard Management Company. Last but not least, Marianne Megaris joined Hardtree Partners in November 2021 to lead climate advisory for Environmental Products Desk and Vertree, Hardtree's voluntary carbon business. With over a decade of experience in corporate sustainability and strategy, she works with companies predominantly in the energy and industrial sectors on their approaches to climate change and decarbonization, including how to access environmental markets and leverage climate finance. She has led engagements through all stages of the corporate journey to net zero, from risk and materiality to environmental footprinting, emissions reductions, target setting, carbon portfolio development, and disclosure. Prior to Hardtree, Marianne was at South Pole, where she built the North American advisory business, as well as Deloitte Consulting, Insight, and the World Economic Forum. All right, three of you, lots of wisdom on this panel as well. I will turn off my video and let you go for it.
Thank you so much, Sam, for the introductions. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this discussion on VCM participation, business and legal considerations for buyers with me, Luciana and Marianne. We're going to dive into some of the risks and opportunities facing buyers of carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets, and we'll also think about some of the trends and themes we're seeing, particularly the focus on integrity and transparency to address greenwashing concerns. By way of recap of the previous two really interesting sessions, and also by way of a short introduction to this panel, clearly the voluntary carbon markets is rather fragmented. It's very technical in nature, which can make it difficult for even the most sophisticated buyers to navigate. Nevertheless, from my perspective, and I advise financial corporate clients in this area, I think there is a general increasing awareness, not only of how businesses can in principle use carbon credits, but also of the potential for voluntary carbon markets to help finance the climate mitigation projects, from nature-based solutions like afforestation to tech-based solutions such as direct air capture, all as part of efforts to achieve net zero emissions by around mid-century. And in that respect, I thought what Francis was talking about earlier on the panel was really fascinating, and it reminded me of the point that Mark Carney and others have made. Carney has described climate change as essentially a crisis of valuation and values. In other words, a failure of financial value to reflect society's value. And Carney actually uses the Amazon rainforest as an example of this disconnect. The fact is only when a rainforest is cleared for farming that it has market value. And I think we all see the potential for carbon pricing through voluntary carbon markets to offer one potential way to address that market failure, and also the political economy issues that Francis spoke about. And the same goes, I think, with tech-based solutions, as we've heard the IPCC's report from earlier this year. focuses on the necessary role of carbon removals to limit post-industrial warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there too, the voluntary carbon markets has a potentially important role to play in supporting new technologies. So if we think about the buyers on the demand side, as we heard again on the first panel, over the past few years, we've witnessed this proliferation of climate and net zero commitments by corporates, and that in turn has driven the corporate buying of carbon credits. But there is, and we're going to hear a lot of really interesting insights, I know, from Luciana and Myriad on this. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of risk for buyers to navigate, both commercial and legal. And then, of course, there are this range of serious concerns from a number of stakeholders, including that carbon credits don't actually represent the emissions reductions or removals that they claim to, or that ultimately voluntary carbon markets are disincentivizing businesses from rigorously reducing their own emissions. And we do have the voluntary net zero standards that are beginning to emerge, such as SBTi's corporate net zero standards. And these are seeking to establish how high quality carbon credits can be used as part of a business's Paris Agreement aligned climate strategy. But the VCMs themselves, they remain essentially unregulated. And instead we have the carbon registries such as Vera, we have the voluntary standards for verified carbon credits that meet certain technical standards. But as we've heard from the other panels, there are these concerns being voiced by stakeholders over a number of technical issues, such as additionality and permanence. And we are seeing efforts underway to address those concerns. So as we've heard, we have the new market-led initiatives such as the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets and also the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. And they're both seeking to establish standards on the demand and supply side respectively. I think very importantly, we should flag though that there's also now a number of regulators focused on this. Here in the US, we have the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, we have the SEC, we have the Federal Trade Commission. They're all paying closer attention to the voluntary carbon markets, as indeed are regulators in other jurisdictions around the world. So in short, the risk of greenwashing litigation, enforcement action concerning use of carbon credits is real. And as we're hearing, meanwhile, the market's continuing to rapidly develop and innovate. We yet to see how Article 6 of the Paris Agreement may impact the voluntary carbon markets. If we have time, we'll come back to that towards the end, I think. But that's a brief introductory snapshot. It's really great to have Luciana and Myriad here with us to provide the practical perspectives on the risks and opportunities for buyers and how this is impacting buyers' strategies and the diligence processes. So I think to kick us off and to take a big picture view, maybe I could ask both of you to give us an overview of your backgrounds and the perspective you bring to this subject, and also what your companies are doing and where you fit in the voluntary carbon market ecosystem. And I don't know if Luciana, you want to go first?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Well, as Sam explained, I'm the General Counsel of NCX. NCX is a data-driven marketplace for forest carbon credits. We connect corporate net zero leaders with US landowners to produce high-integrity carbon credits that help address the climate emergency. NCX helps landowners of all sizes in all lower 48 states to generate and commercialize carbon credits from their forested acres. We have worked with 3,800 public and private landowners on more than 5 million acres. Our first year resulted in 1.13 million metric tons of carbon dioxide of expected climate impact from forests across an area larger than the state of Connecticut. As far as my background, just a little bit more detail. I spent a lot of time in my career working in forestry investments and agriculture, and that's my basic background, and that's why I'm very excited about what we do at NCX.
Thank you. Myriad?
Thanks all. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I lead environmental strategy and advisory for Hard-to-abate Partners, which is a commodities trading firm, and Voluntary, which is our voluntary carbon business and platform for decarbonization solutions. So in this role, leverage my background, which is in corporate strategy, management consulting, and sustainability, to really help shape and develop this voluntary carbon market ecosystem and guide market participants, who are primarily corporate buyers, on how they can most effectively set and achieve their net zero emissions reductions targets and leverage environmental markets as a part of that. So, we set up Voluntary in 2020 to provide a full end-to-end solution for voluntary carbon and for decarbonization more broadly. And so what this means is we do everything from directly financing and developing carbon projects, predominantly nature-based, although we are increasingly looking at other technology types and removals, to doing the trading and risk management midstream. We sell directly to end buyers and help them build really the most effective carbon portfolios that will meet their needs, and also make principal investments into climate technologies that will either directly help unlock new parts of the voluntary carbon market or move us closer to the global net zero 2050 goal. So through this lens, I'll really be focusing today on the business perspective for corporate buyers, as well as attempting to shed some light on the often opaque and or misunderstood role of trading in the voluntary carbon market ecosystem.
Super helpful, thank you. And I think this is a good point to, again, taking a broad overview, try and explain how, as a practical matter, the voluntary carbon markets work from both of your perspective, and give us a sense of what is the life cycle of the carbon credits from projects acquisition through to credit issuance, trading, retirement. So can you give us a sense of how that works in practice?
Sure, I can kick us off here, and very cognizant that we have quite a wide-ranging audience with various levels of exposure to the market. So I'll start with a 30,000-foot overview, and then we can hopefully use this to dig into bits and pieces of this whole process, right? So, you have various activities, project activities, that can reduce the amount of emissions that are either being emitted into the atmosphere today, so that would be known as avoidance, or you can do something that physically removes carbon that's already in the atmosphere, which is what we call a removal. So you have different project activities that are either classified as avoidance or removal all over the world, and each of these activities has a scientific methodology associated with it that is verified by different standards and registry bodies, which we'll come to, and how much carbon you can claim is being avoided or reduced by the project type. So, a project life cycle, it starts with pre-feasibility studies and then feasibility studies to sort of test the assumptions around a certain activity in a certain area and the amount of credits it might be able to produce. In the nature-based world, this often entails working with local communities. So you have to go through processes such as free and prior informed consent. And then, when there is actually validation by your registry or standard body that you want to be issuing the credits under, at a certain point, you can set up the project design documents in line with the methodology. It gets certified by those organizations. And then once the project is up and running, which again can take years depending on what you are doing. If you can imagine, if you're planting a tree, from the day the seedling goes in the ground, there's some lead time to when the tree is sequestering carbon. But once those credits are issued, they can either be directly bought and sold, or they can be traded amongst the market. But ultimately, the end user is what we call the retiree, because they retire that credit off the central registry of whatever that registry or standard body is that the credit was issued under. So it's really in its entirety a pretty well accounted for system, especially when you look at the way the market has evolved over the past 2 years or so. Now, these project activities, they can range from technological solutions such as renewable energy, which was really the start of the carbon market. Now today, renewable energy in the developed world is no longer really considered additional, and we'll get to the point of additionality. I think it was also covered a bit in the first panel. But there's also different technological solutions such as changing activities such as their reduced methane flaring from oil and gas operations. You can also look at the preservation of land and carbon sinks, so preserving coastal ecosystems or forestry and the whole host of nature-based carbon credits that are possible there. A significant focus of the voluntary carbon market in recent years has been on these nature-based solutions, although recently we're starting to see more of a shift in interest to technology with things like direct air capture and innovative climate technology solutions coming more to the forefront. these are also technologies that can really use climate financing to scale and commercialize to the extent that they will help us solve the climate challenge. That being said, for carbon markets to work effectively, we really need both nature and technology, right? And both avoidance and the scale up of removal credits. So what's interesting about nature-based solutions today is that they actually are the most cost-effective and scalable option that we have to address the climate challenge. So, the forestry and land use sector, for example, can mitigate 30% of what is needed to avoid, exceeding global warming over 1.5 degrees Celsius. And you have to remember that to meet that goal of the Paris Agreement, we have to eliminate 46 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which is the world's combined annual emissions at present. So when you think about the fact that % of that, these are pretty significant numbers that are also coming at effective cost. So I'll pause there. Luciana, I would love to hear your perspectives and elaboration on the nature side of this market in particular, based on your experience and work at NCX.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about NCX process and how it works and how it's a bit different from other projects. So we are a marketplace. We connect buyers and sellers. Our sellers are landowners. So the first stage is the enrollment phase, where buyers place orders and landowners enroll their acres. Then we have the assessment phase, where we assess each property's unique risk of harvest. We determine the baseline using base map. Is the first ever high resolution forest map of the sizes and species of trees on every acre of forest in America, generated at a 30 by 30 meter resolution. The next step is to generate predictions of carbon at risk using our baseline model. Baseline predictions integrate base map data with other data about landowner harvest behavior, including ecological, economic, and social dynamics across the landscape. We collect the first round of plot data at the start of the harvest deferral commitment and use it to refine our initial predictions of carbon at risk. Then the landowners defer harvest for a year. At that point, we collect the second round of data after the harvest deferral has occurred to assess the change in carbon from the beginning to the end of the activity period. The difference between the final deferred carbon estimate and our initial estimate of carbon at risk determine the final number of credits generated in the form of carbon deferral credits. These carbon deferral credits quantify the amount of deferred carbon created by each property during one activity period and are measured in units of ton years. 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is stored for 1 year. We report the HDCs deferred in units of ton years generated to landowners and buyers through our web portals and impact reports. And then after that, we deliver the credits. And I just want to add one thought on tech solutions. I think they are great and they can really make an impact. But from my perspective, the climate issues we have is not just about carbon. It's also about the impact in nature, other things like biodiversity and water. So I think nature-based solutions can help address those issues too.
Yeah, I think we've had some interesting insights from you and also from the first panel about the importance of nature-based solutions, not purely through the carbon lens, but taking account of a broader range of issues. Just to go back to you, it was a really interesting overview. Do you typically see that projects these days are being registered and credits are being issued through one of the core registries and standards, or is there a coalescence towards those registries, which of course they're not formal mandatory regulatory bodies, but they have a sort of quasi-regulatory function in many respects?
Absolutely, it's a great question, and the simple answer is yes. So Verra, for example, Verra now has 80 to 85% of the voluntary carbon credits on the market today are Verra certified. Then gold standard is probably the next by volume, and then CAR, ACR, Climate Action Reserve and American Carbon Registry, which are two very big standards in the United States. And then, of course, we have a whole host of other standards, following from there, as Luciana's explained, and many others. You're starting to see additional standards and registries arise, particularly around the removal space, because the reality is, very often Verra can't always move as quickly as the market would like on new methodologies and rollouts. So you've started to see some emergence of other bodies coming up. But when you look holistically, the vast majority of credits are still being registered and certified and then retired under Verra and Gold Standard, CAR or ACR. And this is important, and it's a balance, right? Because we ultimately want to be leveraging the market at scale as much as possible. And if buyers are accepting a broader range of credit types and servicing their needs, and the market accepts that, then that's a fantastic direction for us to go in. But the coalescence around, Verra and Gold Standard, for example, has been really helpful over the past 18 to 24 months, as you alluded to, because they act in a sort of quasi-regulatory capacity, right? There is a central registry. The Verra registry is public, so you can go on there, any one of us, and see, who has a Verra account and what have they retired and when. And so it's enabling a degree of transparency that I think is often misunderstood by the mainstream public and media. Do we have a long way to go still? Arguably, yes, but the registries play a really important role. And ultimately, I think, and this is my personal view, they're starting to pave the way for a landscape where you might imagine a more regulated environment, right? So on the trading side as well, it's worth noting the vast majority of credits that we finance and develop and bring to market and then sell or trade are Verra registered because there's been the emergence of exchange traded contracts over the past few years, right? So we can now buy and sell these credits on exchanges and make more predictions around price and, increase market liquidity and increase participation. And one of the flagship first contracts was the NGO standard, and Verra is a requirement to be deliverable into the NGO contract. So part of the reason you've started to see Verra rise to the top in terms of quantity of credits is simply because of this increased amount of trading activity that was happening and price discovery as a result.
Yeah, really fascinating. A great overview, I think. And I think those trends, we can come back to that relationship between what we're seeing from the registries and potentially regulation a bit later on. And also it'd be great to dig a little deeper into the characteristics and features that are required for verification by these registries. But perhaps for now, we can take a look at the kind of the contractual structures and the underlying documentation, the legal aspects that you both are dealing with in your work, both from the outset of a project, from the emissions reduction purchase agreement through to, as you're describing, Muir trading. So I don't know if Muir, you want to go first, or Luciana, but whatever you prefer.
Miriam, why don't you go first?
Sure. Okay. Well, because I think I'll cover more of the conventional and then pass to you. So look, on the upstream side, or project origination, as we say, as you mentioned, Paul, emissions reduction purchase agreements, known as ERPAs, really govern purchases, or as we call them, offtakes of credits from projects, right? So this is the contract type that is most common in the market. It's essentially a legacy from the Kyoto Protocol and the Clean Development Mechanism, which was sort of the first iteration of a carbon market. Today, in the VCM, in the voluntary carbon market, there's actually still no concept of a standard ERPA. So everyone is creating their own. And I won't get into the minute details here because it's boring, and I'm also cognizant there are a lot of lawyers on this call. But these agreements are essentially used when purchasing credits from a project developer upstream, and they govern the terms under which that happens, right? So because in carbon, you are getting deliveries into the future of these credits, right? You need to govern the terms of that. What are the anticipated volumes, delivery schedules, pricing, contingencies, reps, warranties, et cetera. Now, it's important to note that the market is trying to create more standard documentation with initiatives being run by AIDA, which is the International Emissions Trading Association, as well as ISDA. I think then you have offshoots of this. So for example, using Virtury, because we directly enter ERPAs with developers, but we then also might sell, we might then have a SERPA where we are negotiate an agreement with the buyer of credit. Because we sit in that middle of the chain, we would make sure that the terms of the IRPA match the terms of a SERPA, right? So there's a lot of different mechanisms by which folks in the market today are using these framework agreements. They tend to cover the same types of topics, right? And especially on the selling side, the key thing that comes up for most buyers is obviously title of the credit. So you want to make sure that the credit has not been used or retired by anyone else, and the person you're buying the credit from has the right to legally give you that title. I think I'd like to focus a bit as well here on actual buying structures associated with these contracts. So, the reason that IRPAs have existed and for a long time, they were sort of direct between project developers and buyers at large volumes themselves, or what we could call the intermediaries or the retailers in the carbon market. And these then governed and went on, and the predominant market transaction type were spot transactions. So if I was a buyer of credits, say a corporation, once a year, I would go, probably to a retailer, an intermediary. I would say, these are my requirements, my volumes. I would like XYZ types of projects. And then they would sort of say, okay, here's what we have available, what prices, and you would make that one-off spot purchase. Spot purchases are always from credits that actually exist today, right? They are issued tons, they are ready to be retired. And in the early days of the market and in certain buying situations, that makes a ton of sense if you're doing a one-off purchase. But you also need to bear in mind that these are highly manual transactions, right? And that increases transaction costs, and it also limits the total share of the market spending that ultimately makes it back to the projects and, in a lot of cases, the local communities on the ground. So there's another really important buying model, which is long-term offtakes. And here, buyers are committing to future volumes coming from a project or a bundled portfolio of projects if you want to diversify your risk. So for example, you could commit to buy from a portfolio of nature-based or removals projects for 2, 5, even up to 10 years, right? And instead of doing just that annual spot purchase in the market. And this is really important for the evolution and sophistication of the market for a few reasons. One is that it guarantees ongoing financing to the projects and to the local communities, right? So it sends a really strong price signal to project developers, to local communities, to governments that carbon markets are here to stay, are functioning effectively, and the financing will continue to flow because buyers have put that faith in and shown that they will continue buying the credits into perpetuity. Not perpetuity, into the terms of, how many years they negotiated. On the flip side, for buyers, while spot transactions have been really attractive because it's one-off, the price is fixed, most corporates have a budget, and I understand that you want to know how much you're spending. With a forward offtake, you can still do that at a fixed price, but you're guaranteeing delivery of those credits. So if you are someone who has large carbon exposure, or you have 2025, 2030, net zero 2050 goal, you need to make sure you meet that goal. It's actually a lot safer to start considering forward offtakes because then you know that your credits are coming and you can get into a bit more project exclusivity. You can directly finance a project. You can perhaps be the sole or one of the few offtakers of certain projects, which can really do wonders for corporate positioning, ESG strategy, as well as the ability to know that you're meeting these net zero goals. At its most sophisticated level, and this is where the role of trading comes in, when you start looking at long-term offtakes, they can be on a fixed price basis, which is usually where most clients want to start. But you can also look at floating price agreements. And this, while it may seem a little riskier in terms of knowing what price you're going to pay, is really important when you think about the fundamental market mechanism and fair value, right? Because agreeing to buy carbon on a floating price, which is linked to an index, which means you're always getting it at what the fair market value is when those credits are getting delivered, it means that the fair market value is going back to the project and going back to the local communities. It also means that the traders are able to trade more and generate more liquidity, which over time will develop the market, increase volumes, and probably increase the diversity and complexity of supply available to buyers. So, there was an example in the media recently of BP, and I hate to call it out, but it's a very powerful one, right? Where BP entered long-term offtake agreements on a fixed price basis, and the price of these carbon credits went up significantly. And so they really got burned in the news because they were essentially limiting the money that should have gone back to the local communities. And so I think when we think about corporate buying considerations and greenwashing risk, these advanced buying structures, now that we have the market infrastructure to enable them, really make a lot of sense for more and more buyers. So I'll pause there and pass it over.
Yeah. So what I would like to add is, so our contracts are very specific to our product. And so a lot of the issues that Myriad just raised are not necessarily applicable. But also in some respects, the risk is quite different and reduced because our contracts are short-term and they look backwards. And also we work with a pretty broad range of landowners. Some of them are small, some of them are, family-owned working forests. So the type of landowner that we deal with is very diverse. There's also a lot of diversity from a geographic perspective. So far, we've been working only in the US. We have a pilot program in Canada, and we're looking at pilot program in Mexico. And particularly in Mexico, the issues are totally different from the ones we find with land ownership and the type of landowners in the US and Canada. But again, it's everything is it's looked at in a much shorter period of time. It's a 1-year contract that the landowners enter into, and of course they are forward contracts because we have to wait for that time where the landowner did not harvest, and we verify that, and that's when the credit is issued. So just I think for the audience to see that there are different options and some pretty new as ours.
Yeah,
I think
really. That's
sorry. I think that's so fascinating and really reflective of the evolution of the market, right? That you see these different types of buying structures and increased sophistication. And, I think one of the really common themes is forward looking, but then you've got the innovative structures of, these NCX contracts as well that are taking the retrospective angle. So, I think this should really encourage buyers that, despite some of the hesitancy and concerns about greenwashing or, a lack of understanding of the market, you're really seeing this evolution of different buying options that can plug and play to fit the needs of a certain corporate portfolio.
You've both alluded to ESG and social impact issues of projects, and I think we'll come back to that because I think you've really, both of you have illustrated the importance of diligence because this is a potentially diverse and at times fragmented market. It's important for buyers to understand precisely what the transactions of the underlying credits and the transactions that they're entering into concern. So let's just delve into that a little bit and think about what are the main considerations, what are the qualifying criteria for a carbon project. I'm thinking we've heard a little bit on this from the first and second panels, but the ideas of the concepts of additionality and permanence and these kind of criteria, how should buyers be thinking about that? Maybe Lucian, we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So on this, well, I know some of the other panelists talk about additionality. So I think as we know, means the carbon removed or emissions avoided that would not have occurred without the financing provided by the carbon offset project. So the additionality is determined through the comparison of the anticipated emissions or removals to a counterfactual baseline. And this is a minimum requirement for any real offset generated. I would like to, in this context, explain a little bit, how we deal with some of the issues that relate to, problems with additionality. In the case of NCX, what we do is we ensure that the landowners, when they go through this enrollment process, we ask them to submit information on all the land they hold, not just the land that they are going to be putting in our program, so that we can see whether there could be any leakage, because we don't want them to say, oh, I'm not going to harvest this plot, but then they end up harvesting everything in another plot. So we have those type of controls in place. The other thing is to ensure that the people that are contracting with us, and this goes, we can talk a little bit later more about in the context of ESG and land tenure, but it's very important that the person we are contracting with is the actual owner and has control of the property for this reason, to ensure that that is the person that is going to not it's going to do what they say under the agreement, but also it's not like someone else is going to go and cut all the trees we're trying to preserve somewhere else. Then NCX on the topic of permanence also has a little bit of a different, I wouldn't say a different perspective, but because our contracts are backwards looking, it's a little different. So as we know by now, at least through our panelists, permanence is the nature. It's nature that it refers to the amount of reversal risk that could be in a carbon project. So a highly permanent project has no reversal risk. In nature-based solutions, permanence tends to be a bit more problematic. Often, nature-based carbon credits are presumed to be permanent for 100 years. When purchasing such credits, buyers effectively pay upfront for the full benefit of 100 years of carbon storage. This approach exposes offsets to risk of non-delivery and disruptions like wildfire and disease, when inadequately accounting for, can wipe out all the claimed climate benefits. So the current practice, we think that the current practice of using buffer pools as an insurance-like mechanism is not totally adequate. And as Marianne also mentioned, as carbon prices rise, the risk of non-delivery or not getting the money to the landowners, it's higher. So in NCX program, the way we address permanence is it's a year at a time. Carbon credits are deferring that they are measured each and every year. Therefore represent irreversible benefit for that year because we look back. So we measure in ton years. A ton year is simply the storage of 1 ton of carbon for 1 year. Ton year accounting adds the duration component to the volume of carbon. Not including time would be like keeping track of only kilowatts instead of kilowatt hours. Ton year accounting is a method for quantifying the climate impact of a carbon project at any length in single year increments. So NCX credits are ex post credits because landowners are not paid until the full benefit claim has already been delivered. By activating more forests, landowners scale via our distributed marketplace, we can store a massive amount of carbon 1 year at a time during this critical decade, which provides more benefits than storing much smaller amount of carbon for 100 years and just hoping that those trees make it that long. Then as far as our measuring, reporting, and verification methodology, this is critical in every carbon project to ensure that we're generating high quality and additional carbon credits. For NCX, this is done using data. So we use data, but also we use boots on the ground. We do forest inventory. We do samplings of forest inventory data with fine scale remote sensing and cutting edge statistical modeling. Our system uses machine learning approach in which predictive models guide our plot sample, and these data are fed back to improve our model performance every cycle. And then, well, finally, as we also discussed, there's no, double counting is really important. That is, every credit is given serial number, is tracked, and retired, so it cannot be tradable after the climate benefit has been claimed.
Yeah, I think Mark in the second panel really brought out how permanence it's a challenging area to get one's head around when it comes to nature-based solutions, and it's of course an area of focus. And it's interesting to hear the different approaches that are out there. I know a lot of questions coming in. We're starting to run short of time, so that's a really interesting account. And what I think we should turn to now is the issue of ESG issues and social impacts, because of course over the past few years we've seen the mainstreaming of ESG integration by businesses and their consideration of environmental or their consideration of social factors alongside environmental has really started to come to the fore. So I'd be interested to hear your perspectives, both of you, on the key ESG issues that are relevant to actors in voluntary carbon markets. And we do also have a question that's come in, which I think really touches on the example that you gave, Myriad, about how the expected increase in price of carbon over time, how that benefit will be transferred back to original landowners. So we have a question I'll just add in for your consideration as we consider ESG issues. And it's in cases where carbon projects are focused on preservation of forests or reforestation in the developing world, curious to understand to what extent local communities financially benefit from credits created on their lands, and how these benefits shared by the companies managing the projects. That is a great, really interesting question, and ties into some of the points that were to be made. So ESG, social impact in projects. I don't know if, Luciana, you want to kick off with that one?
Yeah, sure. And I'm happy to also respond to that question that I think is very relevant. In our program, we care a lot about what the landowners get. They are really, they are our suppliers, they are our partners. So landowners, we tell them what's the pricing that we are seeing from buyers. And when they submit their acres and their offer to us to put their acres on the program, they choose their price. And then we match their price with the price that a buyer would get. And then our compensation is a markup on that price. But we are totally transparent, and they get what they think is the value they want for their non-harvesting, and we are transparent at what the market prices are. So then, regarding one of the big issues, as I mentioned before, in nature-based solutions, generally, I would say, are land rights and land tenure, and really knowing that you are dealing with the person that has control of that property and owns that property. That is very challenging in some jurisdictions where land tenure is very weak, or where people may not be the actual beneficiaries of the land, or the owners or the people that live there may not be the people that are contracting with developers. So it's very important to make sure you're contracting with the right people. Rural lands also sometimes, and unfortunately in some countries there could be some issues with drug dealings and things of that nature that also involve US laws. So all this is an area of heavy due diligence for any developer or buyer. Then, as we mentioned before, important to make sure people entering into these agreements, particularly long-term agreements, have a free, prior, and informed consent. They understand what they are committing to and the term of that. And then also understand the impact of these projects on local communities. If we are talking about the reforestation process and that land has been converted from forest to agriculture, and the people that are now living in the land or using the land are using it for agriculture, it could be subsistence agriculture. So it can have a real economic impact, the change of use in land. So all those things have to be considered when dealing with local communities. Another aspect that is very important is labor conditions, safety. Forestry is a dangerous industry. Accidents can happen. Health and safety is very important. How does this come into play in these forests? Well, if you have a reforestation project, there are people who are going to be planting, there are people who are going to be taking care of those trees, there are people who are going to be pruning those trees. So there's a lot of activity that can happen, and you have to ensure that it not only complies with local laws, but also to high standards of health and safety. And often these structures involve contracts with governments, or there's some role of the government, could be on permitting, could be on different things, or could be public lands. So anti-corruption issues are critical. Again, it also goes to the issue of making sure the money goes to those who are the ones that are involved in the project, and not some other people that are just facilitating or not really contributing, or being corrupt. So I would say these are some of the most typical ESG issues in these type of projects.
Yeah, such important areas to diligence for buyers and other actors in voluntary carbon markets, and very relevant. The issue of sustainable development impact and safeguards is very relevant to what the ICVCM have been doing with their core carbon principles, and we're going to come to that. Another aspect of ICVCM and other standards and potential regulatory developments concerns greenwashing. So maybe I could quickly bring you in on that, Myriad, and you can give us a sense of the greenwashing risks that are out there and how that impacts strategy and diligence for corporate buyers. And then we can take a look at some of the market-led voluntary standards that are beginning to emerge.
Sounds good, thank you. And building on Luciana's answer there and the question that was originally posed, and this also helps think about how corporates can address their way, and concerns with greenwashing. I think it's really important to come back to the fundamental problem that the voluntary carbon market is trying to fix, right? So ultimately, you're putting a price on carbon to fix the externality, which is that by existing in the world and operating companies and driving cars, we produce greenhouse gas emissions. And the reality is, because that's an externality, we haven't really figured out a better way to solve it other than putting a price on it. To their most fundamental level, it's really an economic formula, right? It's about figuring out how much money needs to go to that local community to incentivize them to, instead of cutting down the tree or using that pasture land for a certain type of grazing, to preserve it and not touch it instead. And instead, look at other employment opportunities or the host of co-benefits that can come. It's really what is that point of trade-off, right? Or on, the flip side, for example, for removals projects, it's how do we incentivize more money going to certain technologies that need money to scale up and commercialize, that otherwise investors are just not interested in putting money towards, right? That is the fundamental purpose of this market. And I think that very often gets lost. And I kind of chuckle because I completely understand the narrative that carbon credits are, a way to buy your way out of a problem. But they're actually just a way to leverage the existing financial system that we all exist in to solve that externality. And I think when corporates can start to tap into that and really come back to the fundamental mechanism, that's where you really start to build a very, very strong and powerful response to greenwashing. Because then it all flows from there, right? You understand the trade-off points, you understand the economic rationale behind where and why you are using offsets. If you've done your homework, right, as a corporate, you're sort of looking at, okay, what are all the different abatement technologies or options, or, things I can do to reduce my own footprint today? And that always comes first, right? So the fundamental corporate climate strategy best practice is you always want to reduce your emissions wherever possible. So as long as you're doing that, again, unless you are a certain type of renewable energy company, the reality is there will always be some existing emissions left. Again, if you're moving through the world, if you're producing things, if you're traveling, no matter what we do, and there's likely to be some delta there, right? And that is where the role of carbon markets and offsets, can come into play. And again, you're not buying your way out of a problem. You're just taking that money and putting it somewhere else to make sure that it's neutralizing or compensating the emissions that you yourself cannot avoid. So I think if you've done that homework and you're able to really clearly put forward a climate strategy that says, this is everything we can do, this is the point we can get to, that gap to be at net zero by 2050 or whatever our target year is, we know we need to fill with, offsets, for example. We're aligning those with maybe our strategy. We're aligning them with our value chain, right? We're reinvesting in areas of the world where we're sourcing our products or our feedstocks from. There's so many ways you can do it. And I think that's also really interesting, is that it can be an opportunity for corporates. A lot of us are afraid of greenwashing today, to the point that you've started to see this new phenomenon of green hushing, right? Which is, companies in the past few months have said, we're actually just not going to talk about our climate and carbon position at all because we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. And it's completely pushing my clients to be a bit bolder and ambitious and say, actually, we need to continue these narratives and talk openly about it, but do it in a science and numbers backed way, because that's really hard to argue with. The other thing I will say there is, a lot of the existing guidance, such as the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, and their initial guidance around net zero, it is still evolving, right? Solving climate change is a really complex and dynamic global challenge. So the solutions to it are equally complex and dynamic and ever-changing. And for example, the new value chain mitigation hierarchy, SBTI has actually said, well, using offsets is actually part of getting to net zero when you look at your value chain and all the mitigation options. So for the first time, we're seeing a little bit more recognition that the voluntary carbon market has a role to play, and it's actually probably going to be impossible to get to net zero without these mechanisms, in addition to everything else that companies and individuals and governments need to do. So I think keeping an eye on the evolving guidance, understanding that it is changing, but being willing to sort of take a strong stand that is backed by the science, that is backed by a really robust climate strategy and a roadmap. And also, leverage it to your advantage. Use this to differentiate yourself in the market, right? Have a net zero product offering. I think greenwashing accusations are very often the ones that concern corporates the most, are those that are coming from the financial community, because very often the reason you're pursuing a lot of this and a lot of ESG strategy is being driven by the desire to get sustainability linked financing, right? And to be in good standing with your shareholders and your financial institutions. So at the end of the day, if you can not only be contributing to climate change, improving your own ESG strategy and positioning, but also adding value to your company through a differentiated product or service, that's going to demonstrate value to your investors, to your shareholders. If we also consider the fact that the world is very likely moving to increased regulation when it comes to carbon, right? And more companies are sitting in jurisdictions or looking holistically and saying, well, we might actually end up in a compliance market one day. Leveraging the voluntary carbon market right now is probably the best way that you can get ahead of that problem. You can start to understand how carbon works. You can start to develop projects or enter those long-term exclusive offtakes. You can start to build a real strategy and position before it's forced upon you and there are significant limitations on it. So those would be kind of the key points to encourage on the thinking on the greenwashing front.
Great insights, and to be the boring lawyer in the conversation, I think there is a lot of risk out there when it comes to greenwashing. So it's important to have all of your experts in the room. So on the business side, you'll obviously have marketing folks involved, but really you need it's a pitch for lawyers, but it's a genuine one. You need to have businesses need to involve their lawyers and their technical experts and external consultants on these kind of decisions, because it is so complex and there is a lot of legal and potentially regulatory risk as well. So that's my plea there, but really interesting insights. On we've got only a few more minutes left, and I think it'd be great if we could cover some of the market-led voluntary initiatives like ICVCM, and also just touch very briefly on the potential mandatory regulatory developments that are coming down the track. And to emphasize my point, it is, I'm afraid to say, important to make sure your lawyers are involved in these kind of decisions when it comes to VCM transactions. So I don't know if we can just in a couple of minutes headline as to what ICVCM and what the VCMI are doing on the supply and demand side, and then we can quickly wrap up with a sense of where we might be headed on regulation.
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off there and do this as briefly as possible. So in summary, ICVCM stands for the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. They are developing what are called the core carbon principles and an assessment framework to basically set common standards and a universal market definition of what constitutes a high quality carbon credit and which crediting programs and methodologies will qualify and sort of be considered high quality from a universal perspective. So the idea is ICVCM and the core carbon principles are really looking to standardize and govern the supply side of the market and get everyone, singing from the same book about what constitutes a high quality credit. VCMI is the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, and they are developing what is called the Claims Code of Practice. And so this is on the demand side, and it is about how to make credible claims. So this is a set of standards and principles and guidance for corporates who are using carbon offsets to, how they can make claims around net zero and the best way to actually use offsets in a way that is credible and will not open them up to accusations of greenwashing. Both of these sets of principles and guidance are in draft form. Public consultation periods have been going on through the summer and the fall. The Claims Code of Practice is now sort of in roadmap testing with a few corporates. basically in some, these initiatives are very much welcomed by, I think, all of us in the market. They're intended to develop more of that common language and understanding and narrative on the supply and the demand side. That being said, again, I always caveat to clients and curious participants, 2 or 3 documents are not going to solve everything or answer every question, right? It's still an evolving market. There has been a lot of feedback from the market on, how prescriptive these need to be, where do you draw the lines, et cetera. But ultimately, it's a really positive development in that it's helping us move forward on common language and commonly understood integrity.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how the consultation periods and the underlying principles develop. We, on the regulatory front, we saw back at the start of the year, or early in the summer, back in June, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, they held a voluntary carbon convening in which they discussed carbon credit supply and demand equality. So we're seeing an uptick in regulatory interest, and the CFTC is currently holding a public consultation, and we're seeing already indications that some stakeholders are very much in favor of the CFTC having pretty strong oversight of carbon credit transactions. We also have the SEC, which has included disclosures on carbon credit use in its proposed climate disclosure rule for public companies, which is expected to come out to potentially sometime early, or be finalized sometime early next year. And then over here in the US, we also have the Federal Trade Commission expected to update its green guides, which do have at the moment some limited guidance on offset marketing claims. So there's evidently things are heating up on the regulatory side, developments elsewhere, such as Europe. We're running short of time, so perhaps, Luciana, I don't know if you have any views on what you see over here and the developments with the SEC or others.
Yeah, no, I think all this is actually going to help a lot to push for transparency, more disclosure, more understanding of these markets, and sort of, really standardize these type of things and help develop the markets. Of course, regulations is always scary. What are they going to say? What are we going to have to do? But I think there is a positive, particularly in this nascent industry.
Yeah, I think we're going to see quite a few developments on the mandatory regulatory front, and it will be interesting to see how the market-led voluntary initiatives influence the development of regulation, because as we saw several years ago, the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, it started out as a voluntary initiative, a market-led initiative, and it has had quite a big impact on mandatory regulation around the world, including now potentially here in the US with the SEC's proposed climate rule. So it's worth seeing what's going on in the market with these voluntary initiatives as a potential guide to what may transpire down the track with mandatory regulation. We've got a couple of minutes left. There were a couple of questions. I'm just scanning up and down, but if there are any final thoughts, Luciana and Myriad, that you have, there was an interesting question about whether cost of carbon is too cheap. I don't know how whether you want to express views on that, and a couple of other questions, but any final thoughts, very welcome.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I think, yes, it is, particularly when we look at the opportunity cost that landowners have not to cut their trees. Yes, the price could be much higher, and that's one of the challenges that we see in this industry. I mean, at least in the forest carbon credits. But I personally, I mean, my thoughts is I'm actually very excited about this market. I know there's a lot of growing pains. I know there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think is as Myriad was saying, this is an opportunity to really acknowledge the value that nature has, and acknowledge the damages that we are causing in our environment, and to really stop this destructive conduct and really improve our own, where we live, our planet. So I think it's challenging. There's a lot of work to do, but some of these things are very encouraging.
Myriad, any final thoughts?
I think that was beautifully said. I echo the sentiments. And my personal view is, I completely agree that the carbon price could be higher. And I think it probably will be higher if the world is serious about getting to net zero, it probably will increase and this market will continue to develop. Of course, nobody knows, but I think the potential that it holds, as Luciano was saying, to really access the tools we have at our disposal, use nature to tackle this problem, scale up innovative technologies, and also have a host of co-benefits in addition to addressing the climate challenge, which can even be, beneficial for your company from a competitive perspective. I mean, that's pretty powerful. So I really encourage folks who are already thinking of participating or curious, to continue dipping their toes in the market and continue these narratives and then the learning process, because I think, as I said earlier, it's a dynamic and complex challenge. It needs dynamic and complex solutions. And, that's what we're going to need to do to get to net zero.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think promoting integrity, promoting transparency, it's a really important process and something that I think all actors in the market are very focused on right now. Thanks so much for your insights. There are some other questions I see. Some of them I think can maybe be posed to the next panel, such as the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the short answer to that question is that we need all we can get to develop, certainly on the tech-based side. But I'm sure there'll be some more input from the next panel on the IRA. So that's it for me. I think, Sam, you're taking back control.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Paul and Marianne and Luciana. That was an awesome discussion. Really appreciate it. A lot to cover in an hour, and I think you did great. Another reminder to everyone, if you want to rewatch anything, there will be a recording of that session as well that'll be distributed, as with all of our sessions.